honored to introduce Father Hehir. J. Bryan Hehir is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also Secretary for Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. Prior to assuming these positions, Bryan served as President and CEO of Catholic Charities USA, and he served on the staff of the USCCB, addressing issues of both foreign and domestic policy. Bryan served on the faculty at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service and the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and on the Harvard Divinity School faculty as Professor of the Practice of Religion and Society and as Dean. His research and writing focus on issues of ethics and foreign policy, Catholic social ethics, and the role of religion in world politics and in U.S. society. Bryan continues to serve on many boards, and he has won many awards. But tonight, we, the Catholic Common Ground Initiative Committee, is delighted to welcome him back as one of our founding members and as an extraordinary and generous parish priest, scholar, teacher, and administrator, Father J. Bryan Hehir.
Thank you very much. At my age, you get reminded of your age regularly. I remember when Sister Mary Johnson was just barely starting her doctoral work. So there's a whole career there. It isn't quite the same kind of reminder when you go to a college and give a lecture at commencement, and somebody comes up and says, "I'm a tenured professor here, and you spoke at my college commencement." This gets to be a circular firing squad. But let me say, whenever I come back to Common Ground, and I've had the opportunity to do so often, it's a great privilege and pleasure, both because of the staff who now are part of Common Ground and the memory of Cardinal Bernardin. Mike Place's wonderful, thoughtful reflection reminded me that that last meeting, or the first public meeting of Common Ground, was the last time I saw the Cardinal, or talked with him for that matter. So, and that picture was taken at that time. So it's a real pleasure for me to be with you tonight. And Sheila basically asked me, under the general title of In the Church and in the World, to sort of rehearse this discussion of Catholic identity and Catholic institutions, to rehearse it in the sense of some sense of history, and to try to identify some of the structural questions that have come out of that history and are with us today. I begin by saying that before I get to the history and then turn to two approaches of how to think about Catholic identity and institutions, and finally to look at the secular context in which our institutions exist, I begin by saying, as I have in the past on this topic, that it has always appeared to me that the Catholic Church was institutional by instinct. I don't know that that's always a plus, but I think it has always been a theme. I love the phrase that John Courtney Murray used to use. He said, Catholicism is not just an idea, it's a thing. And what he meant by that is that the church from early days decided to claim public ground vis-a-vis the power of the most powerful state of its time, the Roman Empire. So the idea of claiming public ground, public space, is part of then what leads to this institution by instinct. And if I'm correct that we are institutional by instinct, then you might argue that the church in the United States took that theme of the larger church and carried it to its perhaps most extreme development. For we built institutions from the beginning. We did it for reasons at one time, and we still do it today. But institutions are part of our fabric. So, to some degree, in this lecture, with the purpose before me, I have to make clear that what I am focusing on, as Mike Place indicated, are what I would call the social institutions of the church, or another way to say it, the Catholic social system: education, healthcare, social service. It really is a striking phenomenon that one religious community, in some form or other, and the forms are very complicated, so I don't want to not make that qualification. In some form or other, one religious community in the United States sponsors the largest private school system in the country, the largest nonprofit healthcare system in the country, and the largest fabric of social service agencies short of the federal and state government. Those are just there. So when the country thinks about what appears to be its deepest questions, how do you educate the young? How do you care for the poor? How do you support families and care for the sick? We may not be perfect, but we're there every day on those things. There is Catholic representation, Catholic presence, Catholic skill set, and Catholic institutions that make it possible. So that's sort of the foreword to the talk. So let me go now through a short history, a proposition that there are two ways to look at identity and Catholic institutions, and then turn to the challenge and context of secular reality in American life. Philip Gleason, one of our preeminent church historians in the 20th century, all you Notre Damers will know him. Phil Gleason, a wonderful, genial man, once wrote an article that said, "When did Catholic identity become a problem?" And the purpose of that question from a historian was that he could remember when Catholic identity was like the air we breathed. We didn't debate it, we didn't analyze it, we didn't wonder about it, we simply lived it. Catholic identity was so close to you that you couldn't miss it, so it wouldn't be worthwhile thinking anymore about it. What made that possible, that Catholic identity was simply accepted? What made it possible were a series of internal realities in the life of Catholicism. A strong, authoritative magisterial teaching, a strong structure internally. But what made it possible in terms of Catholic identity and our social institutions derived from the original purpose of those institutions. Those institutions, whether it be Catholic charities, Catholic hospitals, or Catholic schools, were designed to educate, support, and heal Catholics. They also were staffed by Catholics. So the people served and the people doing the serving were overwhelmingly Catholic. And those institutions, to some degree, were built, in a sense, to build a kind of wall around Catholics in a culture that an immigrant church, not highly educated, and feeling at the margin of the society, even though they wanted to belong, as immigrants do today. That was the background. Institutions for Catholics, staffed by Catholics, for the purpose, in a sense, of protecting, sustaining, and eventually helping Catholics to move into American society. Gleason remembered that, but when he wrote the article about when did Catholic identity become a problem or a question, when he did that, things had changed. There were at least two sets of changes that changed the place that Catholics stood in the society. First of all, in terms of our institutions, at least social service and healthcare, there was external change. Professor Samuel Beer, who taught government at Harvard for many, many years, Beer once wrote an article in which he said it wasn't until the New Deal that the American government accepted responsibility for the social and economic welfare of its population. Before the New Deal, there wasn't an understanding that the government was responsible for at least minimal standards of social and economic welfare. And as soon as the government began to exercise that care for the social and economic welfare of society, it needed partners. It needed partners to work with, because it was more economical to invest money with partners who did multiple tasks in social and economic affairs. And so the Catholics, with all their institutions, were just ready to be there as the collaborator with the state. Now, because of constitutional judgments, this never was the same for education in the first K through 12. But in terms of healthcare and social service, there was an external pull for the church to move us beyond the Catholic community as the primary clientele, and eventually to move us beyond Catholic staffing of the institution. But that external change was complemented perhaps even more powerfully by the internal change of the Second Vatican Council and the document to which I will come back, Gaudium et Spes, which called the church, in a sense, to be a light, a life, an assistance, and a spirit to any society in which it lived. So you had the internal push of the council, the external invitation of the U.S. government, if you will, at various levels. And those two things combined began to change the purpose of these agencies. If you were to take government money, you were to serve everyone. If you were taking government money, you also very likely had a multi-religious staff. And so the internal and external push began to open up these institutions. Moreover, in the larger Catholic community, by the time you got to the last third of the 20th century, of course, the Catholic community itself was in a different position. From the middle of the 19th century till at least World War II, we were defined by most commentators as an immigrant church, living on the edge of American society. But by the 1960s, we had become a post-immigrant church. We are now, I would argue, a post-immigrant and newly immigrant church, but a post-immigrant church by the 1960s. The election of John F. Kennedy symbolically indicated that. And what happened was that the church emerges over the last 50 years in an interesting position in American society. We moved to the center from the 1960s on. We moved to the center of American life. Catholics in elected office, Catholics in corporate leadership, Catholics in union leadership, Catholics in academic life. At every point in which you measure participation in American society, Catholics were present in all the professions. And now, of course, we're back out at the edge again, a church that ministers to more immigrants than anybody else in this society. My colleague Bob Putnam at the Kennedy School has just moved through multiple Catholic audiences because of his research. And he stopped me in the corridor one day about 2 years ago and said, "Bryan, the most important institution in the United States on immigration is the Catholic Church." No qualification about that. So you now have a church that's at the center and at the edge. And to be a center-edge church in itself is an interesting invitation, because people at the edge don't know anybody at the center, and people at the center have to think hard to remember the edge. So the community as a whole has its own dynamic. Its institutions, having been pushed by Vatican II and pulled by the government, now are institutions that serve everyone, that are staffed in a multi-religious way, and see themselves as part of the wider non-governmental service community in the United States. And that non-governmental community in itself is important to talk about. Because if you look at social policy in the United States and compare it with the other advanced industrial democracies, if you compare it with the OECD countries, the other 17, 18 advanced democracies, what stands out about U.S. social policy is that we expect less from the state, more from the market, and a lot from non-governmental organizations. We have a welfare state, but it is a narrowly defined welfare state, if you look at, for example, Europe or Japan. We also depend a lot on the market to do things for people, if you will. Remember the welfare reform debate. Get people to work, get them into the market. Remember the debate about health care. You've got to use the market as part of the solution. So we expect less from the state, more from the market, and that leaves a lot undone. That leaves a lot undone on a whole range of social issues. And into that space, not all of it, but a lot of it is filled by non-governmental activity. And the Catholic Church, as a subset of that non-governmental activity, is what we are talking about here tonight. Now, with that background, let me then ask a bit more about the debate about identity and institutions. And I think it's arguable that there are two approaches to think through this identity/institution relationship. There's what I'll call a functional approach and a substantive approach. I really don't like either of those terms, but I couldn't think of any others, so you've got what I've got. That is to say, and the reason I break it down that way is I think most of our discussion about Catholic identity is about the functional approach. That is to say, where we are in the fabric of healthcare, where we are in the fabric of social service, what's our relationship with the government, with the courts. I'll come back to that, but that's the debate that takes up all the time. I think it is also important to look at what I'd call the substructure, the substantive substructure of Catholic institutions. Because I think what we do is we presuppose that, of course, there is a doctrinal substructure to what we do. But maybe we need to spend more time on that. What I mean by a substantial approach to identity and institutions are the truths which ground our ministry and which we witness to in the wider society by how we do the ministry. It's a twofold argument. It is where our roots are, and it is secondly what our impact potentially on the society is as we carry who we are into the wider society. Now, how do you think about these truths? Well, three ways. So there are what I'd call deep central truths. There are intermediate conclusions drawn from them. And then there are the particular gifts that different Catholic institutions bear witness to and bring into the society. So the deep truths are God, Christ, the Church, and all that flows from that. And as you know, a lot flows from that in Catholicism, but I will leave that to the systematicians. So God, Christ, and the Church, of course, that's where we're rooted. We're Catholic. Flowing from that, an important sector of Catholic truth that flows from those deep truths are what we have come to call the social teaching of the Church. So, all three of the Catholic social systems, health, social service, education, all of them have these intermediate truths and deep truths as their background. The intermediate truths are things like the dignity of the human person. Our institutions exist because of a conviction about them. Another intermediate truth that flows from human dignity, of course, are the moral claims that dignity is entitled to, and we call those human rights. Flowing from the nature of the human person, we call it the social fabric of life, that we are not purely individuals. We do not make it alone, do it alone, live alone, or are destined to be alone. Flowing from that come ideas like the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity. Now, this set of truths, if you will, are not as deep as the Trinity or our Christology or our ecclesiology, but they flow from that. And then there are the particular truths that I think our institutions represent in our daily work in society. So, just an attempt to summarize what I mean. Education, our convictions about faith and reason. That faith offers us an opportunity to go beyond reason, but never beneath it. That theme runs through Catholic education when it's at its best, from K through graduate school. Catholic charities, charity and justice. Our conviction that poverty is neither inevitable nor is it tolerable, and therefore we must be institutionally present in a society that still, even this week, with the quotes good numbers out, still counts 43 million people poor in the wealthiest country in the world, 14 million children among them. Catholic healthcare, dignity, vulnerability, and care. Again, the dignity of the person when he or she is most vulnerable, and the kind of care they can and should receive, and then the very complicated grid that we have about not only healthcare as a good, but the methods and modes of healthcare which are permissible and not permissible. A range of topics that hardly enters healthcare far beyond Catholicism. So the truths that ground us are the truths we take with us into the society. And I think of our social systems in those three entities as having each a different kind of charism, but they do flow from a center. Now the question is, how do we think about ourselves when we locate ourselves in the wider civil society? That's the transition that changes with the ages to some degree, but that's the transition that became very important once the Catholic social system moved beyond serving Catholics, moved out into the wider society, and became such a large part of the landscape of the social policy of the United States. So I submit that the transition from those intermediate and deep truths to the way our institutions function in the society are guided today, in our time, are guided today by two texts and also two popes. First of all, the Declaration on Religious Liberty of Vatican II, and secondly, Gaudium et Spes of Vatican II. And the two popes I'll use, although it could be expanded, are John Paul II and Francis. So what I'm arguing here is that after you get the framework in place, deep truth, intermediate truth, and specific tasks and truth, and after you get our social location in place, where we fit in the fabric of social policy, social welfare, and the political and legal system that is the United States, a topic to come back to. Then the texts that guide us, I think, in understanding our identity are these two texts from the Council and two different kinds of contributions, I think, from two different popes. So the Declaration on Religious Freedom had a very specific objective. Its specific objective was to declare the Catholic teaching on the right to religious freedom. That was a narrowly defined objective. It took an enormous fight to achieve it, but in fact, it was that, quote, simple, if you will, if we could say no one was to be coerced in the life of faith we had said that. But to say that everyone had the right to exercise their faith publicly as well as private, that was the hill that Vatican II climbed. But the point was the text went far beyond its objective, because in addressing the question of religious freedom, the Church had to turn to an address of its relationship to the secular state as it had emerged in one of the two original democracies of the world. The Catholic tradition about secularity has been, I would argue, more positive than is often thought. I root the Catholic grounding on the secular state with Pope Gelasius in the 5th century, 496. Gelasius was in a fight with the emperor, and so he wrote the emperor a letter, a good thing for a pope to do, and he was very polite. He said, "Dear emperor, here is what the world is like. All authority comes from God." He said this to the Roman Empire. Remember, Nero was around not long before that. All authority comes from God, and God has graciously granted you temporal authority, and he has granted me spiritual authority. And basically, we should respect each other. Now, if we do come to conflict, remember that your authority will end one day, but what I represent will not end. And therefore, if we have a fight, I don't think it's going to be equal. But that's just my view. But together, we should help the people of the Roman Empire and stop fighting with each other. That was the beginning of Catholic respect for secularity. Now, we got lost a bit in the 19th century. In the 19th century, we neither respected the secular state nor the secular society, and we didn't conduct ourselves very smartly in the 19th century. When they asked Gregory XVI, "What do you think of the modern liberties? Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion?" Gregory XVI said they are deliramenta, roughly translated, utter madness. So that's where we started in the 19th century thinking about secularity. Pius IX didn't help much. Leo XIII helped some, but it was still a long road from Leo XIII to Vatican II. But by the time we got to Vatican II, there was a new respect for secularity and a new respect for the modern liberties, especially that most sensitive one of religious liberty. So my conclusion about Dignitatis Humanae in its relationship of institutions is that secularity is not in itself hostile to faith or to the church. And a central tenet for us is minimum mutual respect. But then, if you look at the U.S. story, minimal mutual respect goes beyond that. It goes beyond it to the possibility of collaboration, of cooperation, of what Gelasius said we should do, work together for the single community we both serve. That's a first truth that helps ground our institutions. We see the secular state as a potential partner. Not a simple partner, but there's more to that story in a minute. Secondly, there's Gaudium et Spes. Now, where the document on religious liberty was specific, precise, and narrow, even though it had wider implications, Gaudium et Spes was deeper, broader, and more complicated. The question was not simply one right, nor was the question simply the question of church-state relations that went along with Dignitatis Humanae. Now the question as old as the New Testament, the question as old as Augustine's City of God, the question as old and as new as Gaudium et Spes, was how did the church understand the world? Not just the world at any given moment, but how did one understand the world and the church theologically? And how did then one understand the responsibility of the church in its life in the world. Once again, the function of Gaudium et Spes was to change the tenor, the tone, and the substance of the way the church answered that question from the inheritance it had been given in the 19th century. Now, by the time you got to Gaudium et Spes, there was lots of work that had prepared the way for this broad question. And yet, as many of you know, one of the interesting things was that as they prepared for the Second Vatican Council, there was no document on the church in the world. There was no draft document. Gaudium et Spes arose out of the debate of the Second Vatican Council. In the first session of the council, the two issues that absorbed the bishops were the liturgy of the church and the nature of the church. But at the end of the first session, 3 or 4 bishops, among them Montini, stood up and said, all that we've done is necessary to be Catholic, but we haven't done enough. For the world wants to know what the Church of Christ is in our time. What is the Church of Christ in a nuclear age? What is the Church of Christ when the process of decolonization, independence, internal struggles, human rights, what has the church got to say? We haven't answered that question. And so, quite unprepared, there erupted a need for a new document. What became the longest and largest document of Vatican II. Now that was partly because it needed a good editor, and they didn't have time to get there. They just had to pass it as it was, and as you know, you can't go back and do a rerun. So it needed a little help in terms of style, but not in terms of substance. The way had been prepared by the minds of the theologians of Europe, by the minds of Chenu, Congar, de Lubac, the minds that paved the way to move out of the 19th century and to look at the world differently. And so what does Gaudium et Spes say that is helpful to the institutional question? It begins with a recognition of what it describes as the legitimate autonomy of secular institutions and secular disciplines. Now, they're quick to say that autonomy isn't absolute. They're not prepared to say that anything short of God is absolute. But the legitimate autonomy of the state, of civil society, of civil law, is both explicitly granted. Having recognized an autonomous sphere, they then take up the question of what the posture of the church should be, not just to secularity, but to the human community in which we live. And they paint a picture of what came to be called the servant church. Now, the tone of the document was so very different from most of what we had said for 100 years. The tone was different, as it had been with John the 23rd. But you needed more structure, too. And so, as Murray indicated, paragraphs 40 to 42 locate the church in the midst of the secular reality. Paragraphs 40 to 42 say, first, the church has no political charism. The church has no unique gift to make political judgments. Secondly, the church has a religious mission. That is what it is here, to serve the kingdom. But thirdly, and this is the key step, thirdly, the church should carry out its religious ministry in such a way that it fosters 4 secular goals: protection of human dignity, promotion of human rights, providing a sense of meaning to all human activity, and promoting the unity of the human family. Now, sometimes when people say the church shouldn't be political, I say that's exactly right. All I want to be able to do is protect human dignity, promote human rights, foster the unity of the human family, and provide a sense of meaning to all human activity. Give me that, I don't need to be political. It's okay. So that is, in a sense, the posture of the church. So if religious liberty says there's possibility for mutual respect and collaboration between church and state, Gaudium et Spes says we need to recognize where we belong from dignitate humanis. We need to recognize that, and then we need to become the servant church. And the great line of Gaudium et Spes, in the midst of many lines, is when it says the church should stand as the sign and safeguard of the transcendent dignity of the human person. That's the task. That is the beginning of the social task of the church. And you create the institutions to help them. So you combine the two documents, and what do you get? Collaboration is endorsed, the servant church posture is affirmed, and secularity is understood as the context in which we live in the world, and a context that does not have to be hostile. Now, might it become hostile? Is it hostile? Yes, at times it is. And so that's why the church-world question is always in tension. A tension of collaboration, and at other times a tension of critique. And so that's where the two popes come in, because I think they do different things for this social ministry and for the way we think about our institution. John Paul II built strongly on both of these texts. The text on religious liberty was of enormous importance in Poland, because it allowed the church to say what we are after is not only a religious good, but a human good recognized around the world, and you won't let us experience it. On the other hand, he was one of the authors of Gaudium et Spes. I had a Jesuit from Weston in class, French Jesuit, some years ago, Francois de Mortier. He just stepped down as the head of the Gregorian. And he took a course from me at St. John's, and he said that when the Pope came to France, and he came into a hall with academics, and he said, I must tip my biretta to Henri de Lubac. And de Lubac told Francois de Mortier, he said, John Paul II is the man of Gaudium et Spes. That's his text. He used both of the documents as lessons for the church. He drew strong, clear church-state lines. Collaboration needs clear lines. But he wanted a public church, not a war. And he engaged the issues of his day. He wanted the rights of the church recognized and the service of the church offered. And I submit that's still a formula for our institutions. We need to protect our rights to function. And we need to use our, quotes, power placed at the service of the wider society. Francis represents in everything he says and does a church which seeks to collaborate, seeks to correct the world at times, and to inspire the world. If Gaudium et Spes yields a servant church, it has found the servant pope. An ability to capture the imagination of the mind across religious lines, across cultural lines. And it is not only by what he says, but what he does, the little things he does. I'm always amazed at where he chooses to go on these trips. How many times have you heard about Azerbaijan in the newspapers? Well, the world's going to hear about it this weekend. And so he, in a sense, takes Gaudium et Spes to another step. And he's chosen, I think, 3 transnational issues, 3 issues that cut across every nation in the world in one way or another. Inequality, immigration, and the environment. three broad issues that cut across the human factor in world politics today. My shorthand version is that Francis's motto is justice in the world and mercy in the church. And so John Paul II is, in a sense, the Pope as a statesman, and Francis is the world citizen. Justice in the world, mercy in the church. Together, they create an engaged church, a collaborative ministry, and the language of justice, mercy, and human rights. Now, I also think, in the end, I'll bring this to a close, I think they differ. And the difference, I think, can be helpful. When Francis talks about immigration, inequality, the environment, when he talks about the market, and when he talks about globalization, what I hear is the language of a prophet. Prophets were not great at syllogisms, and they really didn't want to spend a lot of time persuading people. Prophets wanted to tell you what was wrong, and it would be nice if you convert now, heart and mind. That's the way Francis talks about these things, which is powerful, which indicts what ought to be indicted many times, but is open to critique, because then people ask questions about the sweeping statement. So a colleague of mine at Kennedy School loves his encyclical on the environment, but he's not sure he's right about the carbon tax. He says it's better to work through the market than against it. That's where John Paul II comes in. He was more analytical, less, in a sense, less of an ability, although he had quite an ability, but less of an ability than Francis had to touch people's minds and hearts, but analytical. If you take him on the market or globalization, he'll say about the market has assets and liabilities. And so we ought to recognize the assets, and then the liabilities and limits. And the way he would basically put it is, the market may guarantee efficiency, but it won't guarantee justice. So you've got to do other things to guarantee justice. And that gives you a chance to do the moral critique of the market or the moral critique of globalization, and then say, and our church is going to help fill in the limits of the market. That's what Catholic Charities is about. And that's what healthcare is about. We know it's an imperfect mechanism. So that brings me to the last question, the way in which we function in this society, our institutions. There are three large realities that are before us: the secular state, the pluralist society, and the market economy. The secular state, the First Amendment essentially, I think, means that religion shall receive no special treatment, but it should have no special discrimination. And a church that thinks of itself as a public thing, claiming public space, creating institutions that do the work of the society, has to both claim its rights, fulfill its duties, and then have enough of a sense of itself in its deep truth, its intermediate truth, and its particular truth to know when a line has been crossed. And so identity kicks in, and one says, we cannot do that, but we will do this. And it simply says the state does not have absolute control. Now, I think that collaboration, the record has been mutually beneficial for the church and American society. And the way we've done it continues to generate questions. because collaboration has meant, in many ways, government and church collaboration in which money is provided for services. Within the church, there are some who think taking any money is illicit cooperation. Within the wider American society, there are secular views that any money should not enhance any religious organization under any circumstance. And to some degree, the unique characteristic of the U.S. that sets it off from Europe is that we have a highly structured framework about distinguishing religion and public life. But we have a pervasively religious society. But while the society is pervasively religious, there are aspects of the society in academic life, secular academic life, and in the law that make it harder at times to collaborate, that do challenge us at the line. Now, that's one challenge that still exists. What enhances that challenge is the pluralist society. When Murray wrote about religious pluralism, he said the pluralism of the United States was Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and secular. That definition of pluralism will not work today. We have 1,000 different religious communities. Murray sought to find a moral consensus so that when you had groups that disagreed on the ultimate questions in life, you could still find a moral consensus to undergird law and policy. The difference from Murray's day is that religious pluralism is now complemented by a much deeper moral pluralism, a much deeper moral pluralism. He could presume more agreement than we can presume. Now, in terms of our collaboration, you quite honestly have to just distinguish different parts of Catholic teaching. Catholic social teaching gets a hearing across the board. Maybe not agreement, but a hearing. Bioethics, more complicated. Sex and gender, more complicated. But now, our contracts and our relationships cut across all of those issues. So sorting out the issues is going to be a task. And the market economy is here as our context. We need the style of both popes, prophetic and analytical, to sort out those questions. So in the end, we're going to need principles, prudence, and political insight to walk the road that keeps our institutions free and flourishing, that keeps our institutions collaborative and cooperative, that keeps our church not deciding that every compromise is a terrible collapse. Principles, prudence, and political insight. We need all three to keep those institutions alive and well. And I submit that is something important for both the church and the society. Thank you very much.